Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always is, well, just me right now, but we will be joined by a very special guest in just a moment. But before we meet that special guest, I just want to say we're a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and dive into some research related to that topic. So this episode is a little bit different, and that kind of stems from where the idea for this interview actually came from. So if you've been listening to the show for a little while, then you'll know that pretty recently we released an episode on mindfulness-based interventions in the classroom. And we were all very happy to see that these, relatively research-based and simple to run programs in terms of mindfulness-based programs had some nice effectiveness in decreasing things like aggression or disruptive behavior in the classroom. And while there has been a lot of research on mindfulness-based programs for adults, really it seems like the mindfulness-based research for younger, adolescents and children is really just starting to kind of pick up some steam. Now, while we were preparing that episode, I did a quick search into some of the research and, beyond the articles that we discussed in that episode, I should say, and noticed the name Dr. Singh, BCBAD, come up multiple times, also referenced to a Soles of the Feet curricula. So I did a little bit more digging as we were preparing for that episode, and I did find that Dr. Singh, along with his colleague, Dr. Joshua Felver from Syracuse University, had written a recent book on mindfulness-based strategies in the classroom. Now, this being something that I was very interested in learning more about because, we're only able to cover so much research in any given episode. So I wanted to do a little bit more of my own digging, just kind of for my own curiosity as someone who works in classrooms. I was able to get in touch with Dr. Felver to discuss the book Mindfulness in the Classroom, which also shows a replicable means of running the Soles of the Feet curriculum that had been referenced in so many of the research articles that we'd, reviewed, and then, the few we discussed more at length in our episode on mindfulness in the classroom. So Dr. Felver was very kind to give up quite a lot of his time to answer pretty much any question I could think of all about mindfulness and how mindfulness-based practices can be used in a classroom, as well as what are some things that we as practitioners interested in mindfulness-based programs should be thinking about, what research is there, and what does the future hold for mindfulness-based programming and mindfulness-based curricula. It was a real treat talking with Dr. Felver, and since it was something that I originally thought, maybe we'll get a couple minutes, we can chat a little bit about it. It was really going to be a bonus episode, but given how much time we were able to spend on additional research related to mindfulness, even though really the only citation you're going to see below in the notes was the Mindfulness in the Classroom book that Dr. Felver wrote with Dr. Singh. But there was just so much in our discussion that we're releasing it as a full-length episode because I think we covered much more than I originally thought we would. And it was, real pleasure getting to do that. But that's also the reason you're only going to hear me because, when we were scheduling this interview initially, we weren't able to get all three, myself, Jackie, and Diana here. But if you can stand the sound of my voice, you only have to listen to it a little bit because you're mostly going to get to hear all of the insights from Dr. Felver about his research related to mindfulness-based practices in the classroom. So without any further ado, let's get to that interview. All right, so I am joined on the line by Dr. Joshua Felver, co-author of Mindfulness in the Classroom, who has been working on mindfulness for quite some time in his research lab. Dr. Felver, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Just to get started, I know the co-author of the Mindfulness in the Classroom book, Dr. Singh, is at BCBA, but you are a psychologist by trade. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and your background?
My doctorate's in school psychology. School, clinical, counseling all go to the terminal profession of psychologist. So me personally, my degree was in school psychology, but I did my pre-doc internship in child clinical psychology and my postdoc in school-based day treatment for kids with very high needs. So I'm kind of in between school and child clinical.
For a school psychologist, the issues that you're going to run into really run the gamut. So, and it sounds like that was so much a part of your training was kind of covering all the bases.
Yeah. But I was always interested in kids with more significant mental illness, more severe behavioral problems. I saw school psychology as a way of providing universal support, like it's the only intervention that every kid gets in our society, really. Yeah, I'm a scientist practitioner. My orientation. Right now, I'm an assistant professor at Syracuse University, director of clinical training for our school psychology training program. And then my laboratory the mind-body laboratory. We study mindfulness-based interventions with kids and in community contexts. And we're really interested in a lot of the topics we'll be talking about today, but also with understanding what exactly mindfulness-based practices are, why they work, the neurological, biological mechanisms, and then how we can apply them to health disparities in kids and in our community.
I'm not exactly a neophyte with mindfulness, but I'm certainly far from even a moderate level or early level of expert. That's certainly for sure. But for me, I kind of just came to mindfulness as something that I just kept hearing about. And if I hear about something enough, I stop everything. I say, I got to look into this. Because, when I hear the word mindfulness, especially as kind of a behavior analyst, it sounds like one of those terms like somebody made this up to make a quick buck. But that's certainly not the case. Mindfulness has been around for a while. How did you find yourself wanting to study mindfulness to this degree?
I started actually my doctorate work with the late Ken Merrill with social and emotional learning programs. I was fortunate to have had him and many other very supportive advisors. At the time, I started practicing mindfulness in college and affiliated with different more Buddhist traditions and practice centers. And this was becoming a hot topic in clinical and counseling psychology. And so I brought up the idea of, why aren't we doing this in school psychology? That's the third branch of psychologists. The thing I'm always grateful for is that my advisor said, that's a good idea, you should go for it. And so here I am. I just had unwavering support. Very few people do this in my specific discipline, but in school context and with kids, it's really taken off. So more and more people are doing it. So how did I get into it? Yeah, I came from my own personal practice. I thought it was very interesting. The literature is certainly very compelling with adults, and it's emerging with kids, and it's emerging with kids in schools. Although I think your intuition that you're seeing it a lot is that people are trying to make a buck. That's not inaccurate. I think that's become very popular, but I think some of the enthusiasm has outpaced the evidence base at times.
I know you mentioned that you came to mindfulness as sort of a part of work you were doing with your professor and advisor on social emotional learning. I do tend to see kind of that whole branch of increased focus on social emotional learning and education, really putting the cart before the horse in terms of there is, some good research out there supporting that there are some key skills, and mindfulness is potentially a part of that. But how much of it is real research, like the research that you are doing, that Dr. Singh is doing, versus just this sounds good in a paper, so let's just go ahead and do it. Is social emotional learning and mindfulness, are they kind of categories we should be sort of putting together, or should we be thinking of social emotional learning as kind of a component, mindfulness, a component that you might use in your focus on social emotional learning? Kind of what's the difference between the two?
It depends on who you're asking, really. I think if we're going to take maybe just a historical lens here, I would place mindfulness-based practices in school kind of where like the SEL movement, if you will, was 10, 20 years ago, where there is some emerging evidence, and what evidence there is compelling. So don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a scientist before I'm a mindfulness evangelist, if you will. There is there is good evidence. It's the evidence that makes it compelling for policymakers, I think, is where things are at now. Now, the face value of the practices are that students like it, teachers like it, and if students and teachers are a little more regulated, a little bit less stress, obviously it creates a better learning context. Is it part of SEL? It depends on how you define SEL and how you define mindfulness. We're seeing a lot of SEL programs dabble, if you will. They'll use mindfulness-based practices as part of a comprehensive package. But I think, I'll put my behavioral hat on now. How are we operationalizing this thing we call social emotional learning? How are we operationalizing mindfulness-based practices? So depending on whom you're asking, you'll get different answers. And I think that's kind of where the field is right now. We're trying to get our head around what are we actually talking about here from a little more precision, I think.
In that same regard, when we talk about mindfulness, what exactly are we talking about sometimes? Is it just an umbrella term for any practice that sort of has an origin in maybe Eastern philosophy? Are we talking about specific sets of behaviors? How do I know I'm doing mindfulness rather than just meditation or yoga or something, something along those lines?
Like many great questions, it really depends. We have to be very clear that these practices we're talking about do come from a millennia of traditions in Buddhist theology and practice and other world religions too. So first and foremost, we've got to recognize that's the cultural context from which this technology is being drawn from, if you will. Mm-hmm. Is a mindfulness-based practice religious? I would say no, not the way I think about it, not the way many people think about it. If we're going to look about it as a category of practices, you wouldn't say fasting is a religion, fasting is a practice. Fasting is used by religions, but it's not the actual religion itself. So it's using some of these theory and practices and then maybe translating them into our cultural context is the way I think about it. Two important questions you're having. What is mindfulness and what is mindfulness-based practices? Both good questions, both tough to answer. I'll do my best if you'll permit me.
Of course.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We have to dance between, as a practitioner, how do I understand mindfulness? What does this mean? I would answer that as, if you pause right now and you think about what's your experience, right? We have some visual inputs, sound inputs. I can feel the ground under my feet as I pace in my home office here. Mm-hmm. And I have thoughts and feelings. And these are all elements, if you will, of this moment, right? Mindfulness, as I understand it as a practitioner, is the awareness of what's happening right now. So it's not a component aspect. It's the awareness of these things happening, the container for them, if you will. How do we define that in a Western secular context is a topic of debate. The field is kind of settled on a two-component model of the construct, one being self-regulated attention to the present moment, and the second component being a more qualitative element of acceptance and non-judgment and curiosity, this interest in the experience that's happening and unfolding simply as it is, which is obviously a little bit harder to operationalize, but it's done by myself and others. It's just a little bit more nuanced and debatable. This is my take. This is in my take and others, but it's something that's open for debate. What is mindfulness-based practice? Well, the short answer is curricula that engenders and teaches mindfulness. But then, it's kind of a circular argument to a degree. A lot of the research is happening like right now in my laboratory and in a few other labs across the country are to at least put a stake in the sand, and not to the exclusion of other curricula or practices, but to say, well, if we're going to call something mindfulness, we need to define it, because if we can't define something, it's very hard to replicate and very hard to actually understand the ingredients, if you will, to what's actually causing this myriad of health benefits. You asked a very good question. It's something that's a hot topic right now. I was on a call today. We talked about this very issue. So
I think it's one of the reasons that I found the Mindfulness in the Classroom book so helpful, because it addressed some of those issues, but sort of to the point of what would a classroom teacher or a school psychologist want to know about mindfulness. So it's definitely not overwhelming, but it had a research basis. And I know one of the things that I find frustrating as a practitioner who is often in the schools himself is how many, here's the new initiative regarding mindfulness, and people just sort of throw it out there like, you all know what it is, right? We all know that it works. And I'm like, well, I don't know that. And I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to do it. And why would I actually use this? And, let's all mindful eat for a while. It's like, I'm happy to eat candy that people give me, but what's the point?
But that's a great insight. And that it's, my opinion here is that I think you can hold integrity to this practice and these practices that have a long and storied tradition. And I think we can also take a lens of a scientist and say, well, we're doing something. Well, let's define it and measure it. Because if you can't do that, I have to say, as a behavioral scientist, that rubs me the wrong way. So I really do think it's about being specific, and not to say exclusionary to other practices. That's debatable. Well, we should be talking about something that's definable and operationalizable, and something that we can actually say what it is we're doing. That's how I think as a scientist, at least.
In terms of looking and thinking about mindfulness-based practices in the classroom and their effectiveness, it does seem that there is an increasing amount of research and it's getting better in terms of being, more thorough research, more replicable research, that in general, the trend seems to be that when mindfulness-based practices are used in a classroom, you will often see some improvements. Now, some of those improvements seem to be, more on-task behavior. Some show decreases in disruptive behavior. It doesn't seem like it's all, always exactly the same types of results, especially with children where there's not as much research. But would you mind kind of quickly summarizing some of the general benefits? I'm sure I missed some there or threw some in that maybe aren't as clear as others. But, what should we be seeing in the research, or what do we see, I should say, in the research when mindfulness-based practices are used consistently?
It's following a similar pattern to what we see in a lot of the adult literature. There's consistent findings with things like reductions in stress, anxiety, kind of run-of-the-mill internalizing symptoms. Evidence is pretty good that we have increases in academic behavior. It really depends on the question you're asking and the population that you're asking. And that's led to a lot of theorizing around these, there's a lot of heterogeneous outcomes that we're seeing benefits to, which is what we saw in the adult literature too. So different people are tackling this different ways. My lab and my thinking, it seems like the most consistent evidence is reductions in stress. And we could talk about what is stress and why that makes sense, but stress predicts everything. If you have higher stress burden, that will predict, think about things like that stress model or any aversive coping behavior. This predicts everything. That to me makes a lot of sense, but that's an empirical question. I can measure stress. I can measure physiologically what stress is. I can measure your self-report of it. And then I can use that in a mediational model to see if that is actually driving the effect. But again, it goes back to that, these are testable questions. These aren't, that's, as a behavioral scientist, I care about something that I can measure and put my head around. Short answer is, it's pretty heterogeneous. It seems like reductions to internalizing stress, general health benefits.
When we're talking about mindfulness-based practices, I know one of the questions for I don't want to say a treatment, but for sort of a procedure or a practice that has been in general around for, like you said, over 1,000 years, it does seem like the literature is a bit unclear as to what are the long-term effects. Is this something that needs to be practiced? That if we just have the mindfulness moment in school and we do, the mindfulness unit and then we never talk about it again, will we expect to see a continuation of those improvements, those stress decreasers? And am I right in saying that those kind of long-term effects or the longitudinal effects really aren't very clear, at least in terms of the school-based practice or the practice with children?
Less research on that. And that comes back to, again, just the state of an emerging field of literature. Long-term treatment outcome studies or intervention outcome studies, which is an important distinction we should talk about, especially as it applies to this context. There's just not as much data on those yet, and they're being done right now in labs across the world. But that's what evidence we have. There does seem to be some sustainable effects. My clinical intuition is that it's going to be moderated by sustained practice. So if you keep practicing, you have continued benefits. How much practice? When? Is there a short-term benefit, long-term benefit? Those are great questions. It's just something that people are actively studying right now.
Even though that some of those answers aren't set, there are so many positives, at least in the short-term literature, in terms of the results in the literature, as well as some of the ease of using the treatments, that it at least doesn't seem like there's a lot of harm in starting out with some of these practices, even if maybe you need to keep doing it consistently to see long-term effects. It does seem like at least the short-term benefits are decently documented or well documented in some cases in some populations.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like any, I'll put behavioral hat on. If we're talking about teaching a coping strategy, let's frame it in that way. Well, if it's functional and it's effective, then that becomes self-reinforcing. So I would suspect in the same way, if we're teaching mindfulness skills, and these skills are having benefits that the person who's using them recognize, well, that becomes something that would sustain in and of itself. And there is evidence that these things we call mindfulness practices, formal, like breathing meditations and such, they have their own host of benefits too. So yeah, I would think so.
I want to move and talk a little bit more specifically about the Soles of the Feet curriculum, which is a part of your book in terms of, as a mindfulness-based practice. Now, one of the things that I know is, I think a good distinction though maybe not that important a distinction in the grand scheme of things. Of the soles of the feet refers to a specific mindfulness-based curriculum, but it is not itself like, that's mindfulness right there. It's an example of how mindfulness can be practiced. Am I correct there? I'm not like overgeneralizing or undergeneralizing.
Oh no, you're generalizing spot on. Yeah.
Okay.
It goes back to that idea though of there's many social emotional learning curricula packages out there, right? And there's many mindfulness practices. But if you actually dig into the curricula a little bit and compare and contrast, they're actually rather complicated multi-component interventions. And so they may all share similar thematic elements, but they don't all teach the same things or share 100% of those thematic elements. If that makes any sense. So like, for example, we're doing some research right now trying to define what mindfulness-based practice is. And some of the leading components that are nominated by experts across the world have to do with self-regulated attention, compassion training, empathy. So not just skill and acceptance, for example. So these are things that are like, oh yeah, that's mindfulness. But again, a lot of these mindfulness-based packages teach empathy and they teach these more interpersonal skills, self-awareness, but that's not universal. So your generalization is spot on. What is Soles of the Feet is teaching is something that is considered a mindfulness-based practice. We adhere to some of these core tenets, but we're not trying to teach a multifaceted. It's teaching one thing, this one strategy that's termed within this umbrella package. It has these elements of acceptance and self-regulated attention that make it categorically a mindfulness-based practice. I don't know if that made it more confusing or
it is one of those kind of ongoing challenges, especially with a lot of the other social, emotional curricula that kind of just keep getting seemingly pumped out, is what is the purpose? And I know it is nice to have a book like yours and to have a research base that you refer to, because it at least gives, me or anyone who picks up the book, whether they have, training in psychology, behavior analysis, or they're, just education, at least a framework with which they can think about what is it I'm trying to accomplish by using this curriculum, which I know some of the social emotional curricula, they have these like very lofty goals. You read them and they're like teaching kids to like care and to like be in the moment. I'm like, what's the goal? Like, what is going to happen when I'm done with my 8-week curriculum here? Am I just going to look back and be like, I just wasted everyone's time for like an hour? Like, I can't even see what the difference is and how anyone responds. Whereas you have there's a clear goal at the end of this, at the end of using Soles of the Feet.
I would think that's a distinction. Yeah. I mean, I want to say that I think my interest personally, I'd be very interested to see if mindfulness-based programming was part of K-12 education, how would that affect human development? That to me is the compelling question, right? And to your point, well, how do I know if I've created a compassionate young adult? That's a tough one to define. Not impossible, but it's tough. That's not the intentions of Soles of the Feet. Soles of the Feet is relatively simple. Doesn't matter to say it's easy, but it's simple. It's teaching someone this is a strategy to use during periods of really unpleasant experience. And practice with this, you'll become more fluent. With that fluency, you may have outcomes that are in your best interest, or maybe not. We have to take that kind of agnostic approach. It's something that's experiential.
Now, I know when I was reading through the book, and so when I was kind of looking through the curriculum, and the book is written very much for, I think, a non-practitioner, someone who, like, I haven't read a lot of research about mindfulness, but I can still follow these steps. It did really speak to that idea of, here are sort of the behaviors that you're having your students engage in. Here is sort of, what you're hoping their experience is, but there is a lot of that, I think, fluidity of some of the students might not have that same experience. It reminded me a lot of, say, some of the steps of like acceptance and commitment therapy in terms of like, accepting what's happening right now or acknowledging what's happening right now so that one can then, act in a way that's close to what your values are, rather than this is an unpleasant stimulus. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get the heck out of here, whether that's getting upset or getting in an argument or just putting my head down and like not talking to anyone. Am I kind of off base again? Am I overgeneralizing sort of what's going on here? Or is this kind of in line with sort of your thinking of the mindfulness-based practice?
My opinion is I think you're generalizing it pretty accurately. I mean, there's a piece here that I think a question to get asked a lot is, well, what makes cognitive behavioral therapy different than mindfulness approaches, for example? And there's a really key distinction, because if we're going to put a behavioral lens on it, they share a lot of elements, right? Well, we could call this teaching and coping strategy. We could call this some form of self-regulated training or whatever. But the key distinction is that acceptance piece, that we're not saying that any experience you're having is going to be rejected, pushed away, or unacknowledged. It's the same ideas in DBT or any of the third wave cognitive behavioral strategies, if you want to go down that categorization. But there's a really important, that's such a critical distinction, that even the shift in awareness that an unpleasant experience can be embraced and seen for what it is, it really actually changes it. It changes the context of it. If we're going to call it behavioral terminology, do we undermine the functional relation of it? I don't. I would agree with that. Yeah, I think relational frame theory, that makes sense to me. But that's a very critical distinction. When you're having an unpleasant experience, it is valid. It is here. Why change it? Because you can't. It's happening, right? And we can accept this, and we can do something. And that doing something is not push it away or hold on to it. It's just let it be as it is, and know it for what it is, and know what I want to do next.
We've kind of danced around it a little bit, but I'd love to talk a little bit more specifically about, Soles of the Feet as a curriculum. So sort of beyond the larger question of the mindfulness-based practice and what that is. So I know in the introduction, you and Dr. Singh sort of discuss the origins of it as a program that I know Dr. Singh had sort of put together using the mindfulness research he was aware of to work specifically with a student. And it is literally focusing on, and maybe acknowledging is not the right word, so I please please give me the right term, but changing attention or shifting attention to one's feet. I think I'm underselling the other components that go into the program, but could you talk a little bit more about the general focus of the curriculum itself? What are the components included?
Well, so Dr. Singh developed it. So his work, a large portion of his research and clinical work is in low incidence disability populations. And what he developed Soles of the Feet for, going back 15 years or so, was a simple regulatory strategy, a mindfulness regulatory strategy for people with disruptive behaviors. And we're talking severe intellectual disabilities, comorbid psychiatric, people who are in group homes, low incidence disabilities. And this package he developed was intentionally pretty pared down, given the population. Where I came onto the scene was I reached out to Dr. Singh as a graduate student, interested in this field, and thinking about, and this is a debatable whether this is, if I could talk to my former self, I wouldn't go this this route, but it's a common mistake to take an adult intervention and downward apply it to youth. I know in hindsight, there's better ways of doing that, but that's another conversation. So I saw this intervention. I was like, if it's in the context of an adult with severe intellectual disability, I'm interested in elementary school students who I don't think can handle a 45-minute silent meditation practice developmentally. I wonder if this would translate very well. And certainly kids have a lot of disruptive behaviors in schools, because the school psychologists were oftentimes the frontline consultants when there's problem behaviors in the classroom. So it actually translated very well. In some of my other work, some of the top, and in this work too, some of the topics that I was concerned that kids weren't going to get, they actually get better than adults do. Yeah, so get this. One of my dissertation clinical trials, we taught basically a version of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is the gold standard for adults, to parent-child dyads, so 9 to 11-year-olds and their parents. And when things came up, like what is acceptance, that the kids were teaching the adults it. These beautiful conversations of the child turning around to the parent like, no, Dad, you don't get it. It's already happening. You don't have to change it. How could you change it? And I think that speaks to this idea of acceptance, and one of the beauties of childhood is that they are unconditioned in their thinking. I'll say it that way. There's not as much cognitive interpretation of the world. It's real, and it's here because that's their world.
When you shared that example, I'm sort of thinking of, especially here in America, the learning history of what is it like to feel bad? Well, it's bad. Don't feel bad. Do whatever you can to avoid that.
Yeah.
And how many of us have probably spent,
Oh my God.
20, 30, 40, 50 years thinking, if I feel bad, I'm doing something wrong. I better do something different,
Yep.
rather than acknowledging that, nope, that's a feeling I'm having. That is okay. It's not me, it's the feeling. And, now I can do something different.
There's going to be anthropologists looking at our society in the future saying, why were they so focused on being happy all the time? Happy is a transient state. How could you be happy all the time? But isn't that kind of what we try to say? If you're not happy, then something's wrong, rather than saying part of the rainbow of the human experience is happiness and sadness, and it's pleasant and unpleasant. That suffering, I mean, this is a core tenet of Buddhism. It's worth saying directly, like, look, you're going to die. Everyone else you know is going to die. Change is inevitable. You need to confront this because this is part of what it means to be alive. And I think that this idea that aversive things are to be avoided at all costs is, well, you said it, there's a problem to that. You're teaching that I must be doing something wrong if I'm feeling sad. Well, I mean, there's certainly a point where being sad all the time becomes something that's worth addressing, but the ebbs and flows of life are that's life, which I think is something that's very taught explicitly with mindfulness-based programming.
This also brings me to another question. In terms of the layout of the book, the curriculum, it is very easy to read. You kind of go through the lessons. They're nice and broken down. What's the focus? What's the goal? What are the steps? What are the do's and don'ts? There's a great chapter at the end of like what to do when what all else fails kind of chapter. When I was reading through it, your first chapter is to use this curriculum, whoever is teaching it should have some knowledge or some background in what is mindfulness and have their own like beginning mindfulness practices. To which I'm an adult who has lived in America for his whole life and is in that same situation of, when asked to be mindful, I can talk about it. I can share some research. I can get a guest on the show who can tell me more, and I can hopefully ask good questions about it. I don't know how I'm supposed to practice it though. And I worry that I was reading the curriculum, I was like, oh, I know some students this might be good to try with or might be interested, or some professionals that I might recommend it to. And I'm feeling like, but I'm going to be such a fraud because I can talk the talk, but not walk the walk when it comes to mindfulness. So, I mean, what should I be doing there? Should I stay away, get my own mindfulness in order? Or is it something I can do at the same time as I'm kind of going through the curriculum, maybe with students or others? What is your thought there when it comes to mindfulness and the practice of it or the teaching of it to others?
Rob, you are doing just right. There's nothing to worry about. There is nothing to change. You have arrived, Rob.
Okay.
And you have a lot of work to do. This is a parable I'm paraphrasing, but it's this idea that you are perfect the way you are, and you need to work, accept and change. It's the dialect that we struggle with, these opposing truths that are actually, we can hold these things and they're equally true, that things are okay as they are. And aren't we always trying to understand and do better and work? I mean, these are not, I think you need to hold these both as being true. Now soles of the feet, it's like anything else. You need fluency to teach it, right? Would you want to take a guitar lesson from someone who's never played guitar, or a reading lesson from someone who can't read? I mean, I can pick up a piano book and say, okay, push that button and that makes a sound. And if you push it in this order, a song will happen. But that's not the same thing as actually imparting some of this deeper knowledge. And in particular to mindfulness, and with mindfulness with kids, a lot of the teaching is the embodiment. I'm modeling for them, just like we model any other behavior. Watch me do it. I'm modeling for you acceptance. Hey, you know what? That was really hard. Or, that's okay. Let's try again. That you're showing them through the way you show up, and how you're delivering a curriculum. Does that make sense? Like the embodiment's important. So philosophy, I mean, I think the best way of teaching it is to have some fluency yourself, and this is not just philosophy; it's many other mindfulness curricula. Your teaching draws from your own experience, your own knowledge. Like, that's what I try to underscore in the book. You don't have to believe me that, I mean, I gotta tell you, when I first saw when Nerve sent me that book for the first time, I was with two postdocs. We're planning to study first trial we did in schools, and we read this curricula, and we're like, "Give me a break! This is the most gimmicky nonsense you could ever imagine, right?" And so we said, "All right, let's do this for the next week. Let's just each of us practice it once a day whenever we're feeling frustrated or upset, because that happens every day at some point, right? Someone cuts you off, or you have a disagreement with a friend or a spouse or whatever. Let's just try it out." And we all came back the next week, and you're like, "Man, that actually was pretty effective, wasn't it?" Because you're putting your mind on something else, and you're doing it in a way that is non-judging and accepting. It's a little more tangible than a lot of, and there's no reason for this, but a lot of mindfulness practices are pay attention to your breath. Actually, the somatic experience of breathing is a pretty subtle sensation. The experience of your feet, there's a little more richness to that somatic experience that I think you'll resonate with. And certainly it also helps with if you're upset and you're like doing an angry breathing, like pay attention to your breath. Like, I'm breathing right now. God damn, like
yeah. Who hasn't told the student, just try your deep breathing? Like, what do you think of that? I'll show you breathing.
Yeah. Or if you work with, there's some counterindications of that, either panic disorder or you have anxiety, that could be very unskillful behavior, because that could kick off a panic attack, right? People don't usually have feet or feet. People don't usually feel strongly about it.
Sometimes when I try to do my breathing, I feel like I end up just either like not hyperventilating exactly, but I do some sort of oxygen deprivation the way I'm doing it. And I feel, mellow and I feel better, but I think I've like put myself to sleep slightly. Like I've cut off too much oxygen or something's going wrong. And I'm like, I don't think this is mindfulness so much as, I'm holding my breath or something,
I mean, and there's another place where the literature is conflated, diaphragmatic breathing and doing breathing exercises. Oh yeah, you can kick off a parasympathetic response pretty easily if you do it in a way that's modulating your oxygen and your breathing intake. But that's not the same thing as mindful breathing. Mindful breathing, you're not trying to change your breath. You're just noticing your breath for what it is. If it's angry breath or deep breath, you're not trying to change anything. That's the practice, right?
So when it comes to switching my focus to the feet, I know when I first started reading the book, I was like, what is it? It's a metaphor. It's like, when there were two sets of footprints in the sand kind of thing, God was holding me. But it is literally, having the students and through, multiple practice sessions, focusing on first a positive event, then a negative event, and then, okay, stop, now switch to your feet. And I know you say in the book, I forget the phrasing, but it's like, directive, switch to focusing on your feet. Yeah. So can you remind me again, because it's been a little while since I looked at the book, what are the parts of my feet that I should be thinking of? Because I don't think about my feet too often, other than to be like, feet.
The big idea of the intervention is teaching a little bit explicit instruction around these are the antecedents, so they're establishing operations, or this is what's kicking off when you're having this disruptive behavior. When you get angry in the classroom, if we're an adult with our blood pressure, whatever you want to think about it, there are clear internal signals and external signals that you're getting physiologically aroused, right? That the temperature is rising. And you can notice them, and everybody's signals are different, but there's some general ones like your stomach clenches, fists, maybe your breathing's a little hard, repetitive thoughts, I don't like this isn't fair, how dare they, whatever it is, right? And if you can teach, there it is, that's your red flag, if you will, that's the warning signal. In the book we call it triggers. That's what it is, right? Okay, when you notice that, it's not calm down, it's not stop feeling that. But the instructions are, when you notice that, this is what you do. Take a breath. Notice inhale, notice exhale. Shift your attention to your feet. All of your attention's on your feet. Wiggle your toes. Feel your socks. Notice the pressure of your foot. Go to your heel. I mean, I'm doing it quickly, but you're just giving instructions. Pay attention to these subtle nuances of the somatic experience of your feet. And that's not, feet aren't special. It's just that they're a neutral part of your body. You don't have strong feelings about your feet usually. If you do, maybe it's in there. That's a whole other question, I guess. But yeah, that's it. And then what is the training curricula? Well, once you have some fluency with that, let's start with an easy context. Can you do it when you're experiencing a pleasant emotion? Think about a pleasant experience happened last week, a birthday or something pleasant. Okay. What happens when you go to your feet? Well, for most people, what we find is that that pleasant emotional experience is kind of mitigated because you're not thinking about it. Your attention's elsewhere. Okay, let's think about something unpleasant. When the teacher tells you to sit down and do your work, that causes me to be feeling what we call anger. Go to your feet. Okay, well, you just thought about that thing that happened today in school. Where did the anger go? And there's the hinge here is that still trying to scaffold training of insight into, oh, you know what? I have some volition here of putting my attention somewhere else. And when I do that, there's a change to my experience. And that becomes kind of a pleasant, self-reinforcing thing. Kids like to have, control is another word that we don't try to use in the mindfulness world because control has its own problems. It's like saying, don't feel sad, right?
Sure.
What we do say is that, well, what's that like for you? And kids like it because as a child developmentally, it's like it doesn't feel good to be out of control. And hey, I have some ability to regulate myself. That something about that is naturally just feels good. So yeah, kids like it for that reason, I think.
When you read through the curriculum, and you even say this, very clearly in the book, it just feels too easy. It just feels like, wait a minute, hold on. They're going to be like, think about your feet, kids. Let's just label the parts of your feet, like wiggle your toes and magic. Come on,
exactly.
but this is something that, you do have a whole chapter based on, the research. Like, what does research tell us about this phenomenon, these results? And it's something that you've seen firsthand, in your own experience and, in your own laboratory. What is the thought as to why is this working? Because what you described felt very like, yes, this is real. This is based in research and certainly haven't read the book. I know it's based in research. But if you just sort of threw this out to someone on the street or someone like, I'm looking into mindfulness. What do you know about it, Dr. Felver? I would be like, okay, yeah, thanks for making fun of me with your quick fix here. I'm guessing it's a lot harder than that. Why might it not be? What might people be missing if they're looking into more? Should they be asking certain questions? Should they be just accepting this?
Well, let's not conflate simplicity with easy, right? And I think souls with feet or even mindful breathing, pay attention to your breath. When your attention goes elsewhere, pay attention to your breath. People spend lifetime doing that. Doesn't mean it's easy though.
That's true. That's true.
Right. So you're talking about the evidence for souls with feet? We've done mostly single case research. Dr. Singh's done group designs. It does seem to have, and we have actually a meta-analysis of the single case research that we're about to submit for publication. Large effect sizes. So that's a way of saying that this package of we call souls with feet, it does have reductions in aggressive behavior, disruptive behavior from a single case research design perspective. Right now, my laboratory is looking at it with a little bit different slant, looking at test anxiety for students. And we're seeing some changes to academic performance. And I'm looking forward to analyzing this data set I have of stress reactivity with cortisol production from saliva and more physiological markers of stress. But it's the same idea is that this thing is actually addressing stress, and then stress is actually predictive of a lot of other things. So the literature is pretty compelling. What do I say? It is simple, but I think that the evidence is like, well, I point people to their experience, like, try it for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. The theoretical model is that if you're not on the trajectory of increased physiological arousal, anger, that upward slant, and if you catch that increase in the slope, if you will, early, and put your attention on something neutral, then that can have benefits, or that can actually prevent this escalating behavior pathway. Conceptually, that's how we think about it. And again, it's one of those things that I can say that conceptually, we can intellectualize it, and I can point to peer-reviewed publications and meta-analyses and data, and we can talk about it that way. And I think at the end of the day, if you really are interested in this, try it out. You'll find, I don't know what you'll find because I'm not you, but give it a shot and see what that's like. And then if you find it something that your own experience is like, hey, you know what? I think this technology I'm noticing some benefits to my life. Well, consider that something that could be added to your toolbox with kids. Not the panacea, but it's a solution.
Very well said. Just wanted to pause for 1 minute so we can take a quick break. And when we return, we'll be right back with Dr. Felver and mindfulness-based curricula discussion. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Felver all about mindfulness and mindfulness-based curricula. But before we get back to the interview, I just want to remind you listeners out there that ABA Inside Track is an ACE-approved podcast. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. You just need to listen to the episode and go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus. That's GET-CEUS, and enter in 2 secret code words. The first of those code words is ARCH. ARCH, like an arch in a building, or the arch of your foot. Ooh, relevant, right? Anyway, back to the interview. So, Josh, in talking about soles of the feet, we had a chance to have you kind of run me through the basics of the soles of the feet curriculum looks like in terms of the soles of the feet, quote unquote procedure itself. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the lived-in feel of using a mindfulness curriculum like Soles of the Feet. How do you get a classroom teacher interested? Is there additional training beyond what's in the book that you would recommend? Are there bumps in the road that you've seen in running it that, you've gotten some feedback about, teachers like this, they don't like that, et cetera? Just love to kind of hear the whole shebang about the curriculum that way.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll talk first about mindfulness interventions programming in general, and then I can talk about Soles of the Feet in particular, if that makes sense. So there's a few different ways that teachers come at it. In my experience, maybe the most common way that teachers get interested in mindfulness programming in their settings has to come from their own lived experience, because teachers have a pretty untenable job in a lot of situations, given the demands of their time. I mean, they're asked to do so much with increasingly fewer resources, and it's a very stressful occupation. Actually, in some of my research, I do a lot of research with teacher stress. If you look at I'm laughing because I was just shocked with it. I mean, intuitively know this, but when you look at the data, you're like, oh my God, what are the most stressful occupations? Well, there's like first responders, there's people in the military, there's people who are working in call centers, and there's teachers. And it's alarming, the rates of stress and related mental health, behavioral substance use. One of the most alarming ones is people leave the occupation. So around a third of teachers, they'll leave the profession after being on the job for about 3 years. And if you're in special ed, it's about 2/3 of teachers will quit after 2 years. And that's not quit the school, that's leave the occupation. It's a huge problem. So they're looking for support. And if there's any one thing, like we've talked about, that the mindfulness-based programming has evidence for, it's for stress and this experience of having the burdens of one's life, however you want to define that, in occupational settings or whatever. So teachers look to that. A lot of teachers also look for ways that they can support their students, because students are also under a lot of stress, both generationally. There's increasing trends toward mental health problems among youth. Developmentally, adolescence is in particular, but childhood in general. Adolescence is the most stressful time period of the human lifespan. This is a living creature. And then
I don't even want to think about adolescence. You bring it up, and I want let's change topics. No, I'm having a flashback.
yeah. Well, that's not your imagination. It's when people who are developmental psychologists look at this, it's the most stressful time of the human lifespan, period. And then there's also, anything that's going on in your immediate context. You live in communities with high poverty or community violence, and that's not even mentioning COVID and the pandemic, which is a whole other burden. So there's a lot of reasons people look for support. So that's in general. And I can talk about Souls of the Feet. Souls of the Feet is a mindfulness-based program. It's a tool. Like we've spoken about, it's unique in that it's designed to teach one thing, one coping strategy, one approach, and within this framework of mindfulness-based programming. So when we get the referrals for Souls of the Feet, it's usually for disruptive behavior. Students who are very disruptive in the classroom, students with high rates of aggression, and some behavioral problems. But what we're finding is that when teachers start adopting it, they find it's useful for all their students. And it can really change the whole culture of a classroom to have these practices kind of integrated more seamlessly. And then I could go on about research about that, but I'll just leave it as it has a lot of unique benefits to a classroom setting that has less stress, and it's a little bit more of a calm environment. It's more conducive to learning, really.
We've been talking about what are the behavioral mechanisms behind why mindfulness might work for some, decreasing some behaviors like the disruptive behaviors, whereas it might not in some other areas, might not lead to some of the increases that, I think it would be great to have the panacea, do this and everything will be better. And it's not quite what's going on, even though there are some real positives in the literature. For classrooms, has there been any research or, do you know of any upcoming research that's really sort of looking at what are the overall, larger mechanisms? So are we talking about there's a decrease in disruptive behavior in the classroom because the teacher actually is just demonstrating more mindfulness and is just better able to respond to problem behaviors in ways that isn't likely to sort of reinforce disruptive behavior by, getting upset or throwing children out of the classroom or giving them extra attention for their disruptive behavior? Is it more, kind of a global response? So all of the students are engaging in more mindful behavior. Therefore, there are just more opportunities for catching the students doing, the quote unquote right thing in the classroom. So they're getting more positive attention, or they're seeing more success they're able to focus on their work more. So they're seeing better outcomes that way. Is that even a question that we might want to answer that, but at the same time, teachers might not care because as long as they see an improvement, the why might not matter as much as it happened, the results.
Well, what an insightful question you just asked, Rob.
You're so kind. You're so kind, Josh.
No, I wouldn't say if it wasn't true. The short answer is yes. And there's a lot of ways of people looking at this. So when you are more, and we can think of this in our own lives, we don't have to make this something abstract. We all have days where we're under higher stress and we're in our own heads, or we're thinking about something else. And I think we all know that when we're under those kind of burdens, we're not our best selves. We're not the partner, the parents, or the teacher we want to be. And that we are at other times when we have less of that kind of burden upon us. And that's something we all can relate to, right? So in general, if I was going to give what's my hunch, my theoretical hunch, and there's a few different ways of looking at this, is that when we have less of that burden, a lot of things kind of naturally click better. And people who engage and start doing mindfulness programming, that's kind of one of the central insights. It's that things just kind of are working differently than they did before. And I'm using my words carefully here because a very quick and critical insight is that you have to be okay with the way things are in order to paradoxically have things in a way that perhaps is quote unquote better. And that part of it's like the analogy of those like finger traps that you get at the boardwalk? I'm sorry, I'm from the Northeast.
Do you stick your fingers in, and if you try to pull,
Yeah,
you
that's
can't get your
right.
fingers out? Yeah.
Yeah, they're made of wicker. You get them at amusement parks or whatever. And or you can use the analogy of like a sand trap or quicksand. You're familiar with like that from movies and whatever. And the idea that part of the struggle is what's actually causing some of the struggle in the first place. And that the paradox is that if we can be more accepting of the fact that there is unpleasant things and there are things that are challenging and hard and that we don't want to have them that way, if you can allow those to be, then you can actually have less of the thing that's challenging. And it's a little bit of a paradoxical way of thinking about it, particularly in a Western cultural context where we're not used to handling opposing truth in the same way.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm waxing philosophical. But
that does feel very much in line, I think, with the third wave behavior therapies in terms of just this increasing focus on acceptance, increasing focus on mindfulness, and less of a focus on how are you going to cure your anxiety or your depression or your disruptiveness? How are you going to treat it? And more about it's going to happen. You have to accept it. And then, here are some techniques to then allow you to focus on but what are you going to do after you've accepted it? How are you going to move on, from that rather than being, inflexible or, whichever kind of behavior therapy you're coming at, they have the different terminologies for what that process is, where you see the, students or adults get upset or be unable to come up with a solution or go to old patterns that are potentially damaging.
Exactly. It's that central, if you're familiar with dialectical behavior therapy, that's the central part of it. The central dialect of acceptance and change. How can we be okay with things as they are and work to change these things? And it's something that doesn't compute if you think about things in a Western classical logic model, but that's perhaps that model isn't how things work. And I would argue that that's not.
As a psychologist, you probably know this better than I do as a behavior analyst, but it does seem that so much of the history of mental health supports really were focusing on that kind of medical model of, there's a pill for that, there's a cure for that. Not to bring medication into it, certainly, but that idea of there's something in you, and if we could just get it out, you'd be better. But your issue with, bacterium is not the same as your issue with anxiety or depression.
And that model is the reason why we have a lot of the things that make our life different than 200 years ago. And that model applies when you're thinking of why do people get sick? Well, look, there's a bacteria or a virus, or there's some underlying causal mechanism in a pathogenic process at work. It does not apply if you're going to apply that model to many mental health concerns, because it's not that simple. There's a lot of things at play. The whole premise doesn't really make sense. And there's a bigger issue that I think gets lost in all this conversation. And it goes back to what you're saying. Why is this affecting the classroom? It's the context. It's not just looking at, if the teacher is different, then the context is different. Or if the individual is different, then the teacher is different. It's all of these things, because the context it drives everything, and particularly for kids, but even for ourselves. And a lot of the third wave behavioral therapies are not just altering the external context of our lives and changing things to be more conducive, but it's also altering the context of our inner lives too. How do I approach my own lived experience, and can that be reconceptualized? So, it's all these things. Now, I want to say one last thing is that in a school setting, when we think about child in context, and if we're going to take an approach to this, it has to do with reducing stress. Well, there's something very important to consider here, is that we may not be getting the same benefits of mindfulness programming if there's not a stress burden in the first place, which is one of my favorite models of theory behind why these practices are effective. Comes out of David Creswell's work at Pitt. This idea of a stress buffering hypothesis, meaning that just like we have a lot of other stress buffering mechanisms that underlie everything, right? There's a stress buffering idea that mindfulness-based programming could be effective because it's reducing stress, and you would expect to see the biggest benefits from those who have a higher stress burden in the first place, because if you don't have that stress burden, chances are you're not functioning at the same way as if someone has is someone who doesn't. And increasingly we're seeing data for that too.
That actually kind of somewhat answers a question that I had in terms of when do you know that a mindfulness-based intervention would be, an appropriate recommendation for a classroom. And it sounds like while you might be able to use, say, the number of office visits or the, overall rate of disruptive behaviors or, aggressive behaviors in a classroom, some of it might also be if you have a teacher who's, nope, I'm totally calm. I've totally got a handle on this. That might counterindicate like, well, maybe this isn't going to show as much benefit. Maybe this isn't the solution for this classroom. Am I overgeneralizing there? Or is that sort of...
You make a great point. Yeah, it really, I'm a huge advocate for this. This is my life's work, right? I'm the first to say, yeah, these practices are good for everybody. And I think they're really important in a learning context. But before we talk about, we have to be a clinician first and say, what is the referral problem? And I get people don't necessarily want to hear this when they consult with me or ask me for referrals or, hey, can you come in, give us some supports for our school? When I say, well, look, you're referring for your classrooms are highly disruptive and there's a lot of aggression, there's problems here, and you're looking for support with mindfulness. I think that's great. And we have to think about this as a scientist and a clinician. There are other evidence-based practices that have way better support. So it's not like the only solution. It's not a panacea. And we have to think about the entire armamentarium of supports, about all the technologies we have. And sometimes it's not the right fit. So people don't necessarily want to hear that because they like the idea of this is important. I think this is really innovative and exciting. And I'm like, yeah, it absolutely is. And if your problem is there's problems in English language arts at 5th grade and kids are off the walls and they're not performing well, I got to say, we have to look at what kind of English instruction are they getting in elementary school, because that's you think about this empirically, like, well, and that's another big part of this. It's a long way of saying it depends on what the referral question is.
In a similar note, I know the book itself is broken up into the Soles of the Feet curriculum for a whole group as well as for the individual student. And while I think it seemed like most of the parts were the same, there was more room to sort of breathe with the curriculum or to individualize the curriculum or to provide more practice opportunities when it was to the individual rather than the classroom. Was that sort of, on purpose, that's the goal for students who they're asking, like, I just need to be able to control myself more, sort of like how Dr. Singh originally kind of came up with the curriculum? Would there be other times that you would recommend this makes sense as an individual curriculum rather than a group curriculum?
Yeah, or both, right? So the evidence base for if you have disruptive behavior, and I'm not talking just for kids, for adults too, there's a pretty good evidence base for soles of the feet. We're wrapping up a meta-analysis of the single case designs. It's got large effects, which is great for a short intervention. I would call it, I don't use the term evidence-based practice lightly. I know exactly what that means. It is an evidence-based practice. Trust me, we looked at the data on this. So for a coping strategy for self-regulating behavior, particularly disruptive behavior, it's a great practice. At a group level, this is where I kind of go back. It kind of depends. We've had really good results. We had a wonderful study going on last spring that got just annihilated. And just what I mean is like it got ended because of COVID. But in a class, yeah, it was really a shame. A classroom that have there's individuals in that classroom that have disruptive behavior, but on average, it's just kind of a chaotic classroom. As a clinician, I would first point to the classroom behavior management literature. But as a scientist, and this is my field, we've looked at this, and actually, soles of the feet, if you teach to the whole class, it has really nice results. I think every student benefits, one, from having an individual level coping strategy and a self-regulating routine. But it also, if it's built into this is where it's like the context, if it's built into the day-to-day operations, students walk into school, first 5 minutes of class, all right, everybody, we're going to do our mindfulness practice. And let's take a minute and think about our feet, do some mindful breathing, whatever it may be. It really changes the whole tone of the classroom. And because of that, there's fewer behavior problems. Because of that, students are able to learn better. So we've had some we've done a few replications we're working on of just sitting for 3-4 minutes of mindful breathing before class starts. Students are learning better. Their educational outcomes are better. Why is that? Well, for these reasons. I think they're more regulated. I think they just are able to absorb material better. And the teacher is probably a better teacher because they're not having to be constantly redirecting or under the burdens of having a disrupted classroom.
When you say the academic outcomes are better, are you talking more like standardized tests? Are you talking sort of like by tracking assessment activities in the context of, say, that science or ELA class?
Yeah, the studies we've done, we use curriculum-based measurements. So when it's more standardized, we can compare it to norm-based reference. That's where we're seeing outcomes. We also see them. Grades are a tough one to measure because there's a lot of. It's not as an objective measure as you might think. It depends on because every teacher is going to give their own assessments. Every school has their own metrics. Blah blah blah. But when we do our studies, we look at those and we look at CBM data, and it's more standardized.
It'd be great to run these in math class where it's sort of like, we're going to have a test every week. And, you either got the answer right or you got the answer wrong. Probably be the easiest way to measure some of it.
Sure. Actually, you know what? It's funny you say it. We are doing a clinical trial with, we're hoping to bring it down lower grade levels in high school. But right now we're doing it with freshman college students in soles of feet.
Oh.
Yeah. Get this. I call our university to the academic counseling department, and I say, hey, I'm interested in these stress reduction practices and how this affects academic performance. What's the most stressful course you get from your students? And it's Calc 1, because a lot of students wash out of engineering programs or they have all kinds of problems with it. So we're doing soles of feet with Calc 1 students, and the results have been pretty cool. We're seeing that we measure them on their final exams, and they're actually performing better on the final exams compared to cognitive behavior therapy, which is pretty interesting to us. And then we're also, this is the part I'm really excited about. We had the study wrapped up in the fall to analyze the data, but we're taking saliva samples during the final exam. So you can measure all kinds of stress hormones from a little bit of spit. And so we're hoping to demonstrate this like stress mediating pathway of reduced stress hormones like cortisol and others during the actual stressful event, like your final exam.
I don't think I see that many studies looking at the direct measure of, stress producing hormones. It's usually more this, kind of a social validity, like how stressed are you on a scale of 1 to 5, which, is a measure, but maybe not, the best measure if you.
Well, a lot of those self-report measures are inherently flawed when you look at it. Well, there's a lot of problems in general, but particularly for mindfulness, because we're teaching self-awareness, right? So if I'm asking you, here's a classic example, right? If you ever teach a multi-week mindfulness curriculum and before the day one of the class, you take a poll, how mindful do you think you are? And let's do a survey here. And you can do the same thing for stress. It wouldn't matter. People will say, oh yeah, I'm pretty mindful. And then you ask them a few weeks into practice when they're slowing down and paying attention to the actual lived experience. They're not thinking all the time. They're not daydream. They're actually noticing what's happening. People will say, actually, I'm not mindful at all because I haven't really been paying attention. And in the same way, if we ask people, and then at the end of the curriculum, they say, oh yeah, actually, I think I am getting more mindful. And in the same way, if you ask people, how stressed do you think you are? There is a universal finding. I don't want to be too overly general, but there's a consistent pattern of lack of correlation between one's perception and intention and behavior and reality.
Yeah.
This goes all the way back to Milgram, would you ever kill someone? No. Well, actually 2/3 people will under a certain context. So
sure.
It's the same thing. How mindful do you or how stressed you are? At the end of the day, I'm a behavioral psychologist. I care less about what you think you'll do. I care more about what you are doing or what's actually going on.
Yeah. It reminds me, I think, of like a lot of the self-efficacy research when you ask someone who's just learning how to do a job, like, how good are you at this job? I'm awesome at this job. And then as they get more advanced, they're like, I'm actually not as good as I thought I was. Yeah. It's like, well, exactly. How are you supposed to assess what's going on here? Like, did my treatment work, or did you just get better at assessing, your own limitations as a professional? So that weird paradox there.
which is a little bit, I get some pushback among other psychologists because we rely on self-reports a lot. And I use them all the time, don't get me wrong. But,
Yeah.
Me as a scientist, I'm less interested in your self-report of stress. I'm way more interested in, is your heart rate going up? That to me is fascinating. Is your stress hormones freaking out? That's cool. What's going on in your brain? These are things we can measure.
You're answering a question that I know certainly when you're sharing some of this research with, I think, the average behavior analyst who wants to see, no, what am I observing? Show me the direct measurement. And the more it's self-report, I think we, as a field, gotten much better at accepting that self-reports can be used. But there's always, I think, going to be a part of us saying, I don't know. I'm glad your self-report data looked great on that study, but come back to me when you've done the, heart rate or the cortisol or something direct.
Yeah. You got to have the data, right? Hey,
exactly.
Here's a great quote. This is one of my advisors was the late Tom DeShawn, and his advisor was Gerald Patterson. And this is a great Gerald Patterson quote. "In God we trust, all others must bring data."
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Show me the data. That was another one. And you hear it all the time. Show me the data. Show me the money. Show me
so
the data.
True. Yep. So true.
So, I care about, show me CBM, show me heart rate, show me performance, show me objective measured behaviors that can be done replicably and with fidelity, that's what I care about.
I'm in the same boat. Now, I think that does lead us back kind of to talking about mindfulness in schools, or mindfulness as a adjunct or before using classroom-based management system, depending on sort of your needs as a classroom, is that just because data and just because research points to an effective procedure doesn't mean you're going to get widespread adoption. So I'd love to talk a little bit about what have you seen as adoption rates in classrooms, or maybe even more importantly, as in school districts or school-wide. Is this something where it's pockets of individuals who just they have a need, they've done their own mindfulness and they're on board? Have you found that schools are interested in applying mindfulness-based strategies based on their focus on SEL strategies, that they're just trying to adopt it? Kind of, what are you sort of seeing in whether it's clinical work or in the research base?
Yeah. It's actually changing quite rapidly. I started doing this. One of the first schools I started working in 2007, 2008. And even from then till now, it's just much more mainstream. You can probably think back if you're old enough to when you were a teenager, yoga was or meditation was some really outlandish, exotic thing. And now you can't. It's so much more mainstream that yoga in schools, mindfulness in the classroom are just much more part of our cultural fabric. So I am seeing it being adopted more. That being said, it's not always adopted well. There's a lot of, I think, well-intentioned people that are not necessarily doing things that are always best practice. And there are ethical considerations around what's the boundaries of teaching a secular strategy that is fitting our cultural milieu, and what's actually infringing upon more spiritual belief systems. And that's another rub, right, that I've seen a lot of change in. There's a pushback on, and way less so now, but you're trying to bring religion into our school. And that's why I tell people if you're ever interested in this work, you need to be very considerate and careful, not just for your own success, but because it's the right thing to do, that we live in a secular educational system, cannot be bringing belief systems into school. And I would argue that in this instance, you can both honor the non-secular traditions that a lot of these practices and traditions came from, but you can translate it into our culture and make it real. I don't think it's one or the other. There's a big debate about cultural appropriation, which I'm happy to have with anybody, but I think you can actually maintain integrity and also be mindful of our culture, and a Western U.S. secular educational system has to be at the forefront of your thought process.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about that in terms of both the idea of, is mindfulness cultural appropriation, as well as what should, practitioners I don't want to say be mindful of, but be thinking of when recommending it in terms of, could this be, pushing against the group you're trying to help, cultural norms in a way? Like, what do we want to be, kind of red flags do we want to be aware of? Not that any one group is going to be representative of the whole necessarily, but just to kind of keep in mind.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of my non-secular mindfulness teachers, so coming from a more of a traditional Buddhist tradition, when I was discussing, hey, I want to start teaching this myself, the best piece of advice I ever got is like, teach what you know. And what that gets at, which is a central recommendation to mindfulness-based programming, is that your teaching is going to be drawn from your own lived experience. And it's not, we can talk about behaviorally as embodiment, but it's also recognition of this tradition of like, you shouldn't be teaching and advocating for things that you don't have a direct firsthand experience with. And I don't think and I would argue you can't do it well without that. Now, what constitutes experience? Great question. That's something we're getting at my lab and other labs around the world. What are the actual recommendations if you're going to deliver X, Y, and Z protocol? But at the very least, having some like real understanding of what it is you're trying to teach others is really important. In terms of appropriation, this is a debatable topic. There are strong advocates on either side. I believe that some delivery of contemplative practices, mindfulness, yoga, and others, are not being respectful or maintaining the integrity from which they're drawing upon. And I think that's a problem. I think that there are some who are conflating this technology and conflating this theory and practices that are part of, I'll say, Buddhist traditions, conflating that with the cultural elements that those traditions arose from. And I'm going to say that I recognize it's not quite an easy thing to parse apart. And I think that there is a way of differentiating those. So what is acceptance? What does it mean to be non-judgmental? We can even get a little more subtle. What is compassion? What is empathy? What does it mean to really show kindness? I think you can look at how the traditions that have developed very refined systems of training individuals in these practices. Can we borrow and, I would say, adapt those practices for our culture and give homage and be mindful and maintain the integrity from the cultures with which they were developed? I would argue that's the way to think about it. This is a debate, I guess. Some people
and it's something that honestly, I think, especially if a practitioner were kind of coming to mindfulness, whether it's for their own personal use or starting to look at the research and thinking about how could this be useful in my practice, or do I see individuals who are asking for treatments like this or for systems like mindfulness based curricula, would be one that honestly didn't even come to mind. I mean, I know we talked much earlier about sort of the history of mindfulness, but thinking about it in terms of culture and not just sort of as one more thing. I mean, I guess it's so easy, especially in Western culture, especially in America, to say, hey, this thing looks good in science research and therefore it's fair game. If it's science research, it's fair game. And then sort of just brush aside the fact that there could even be a cultural lens that should be acknowledged, that should be thought of, that would be a part of the teaching process potentially, but again, teaching what you know and knowing what you don't know as well. So I am glad you brought that up. Yep. Although now it's made me a little scared to recommend mindfulness just in case.
Well, I think I have a nice analogy here. If there's Rob's practice of X, Y, and Z, and you've researched it for a long time, and you've published on it, and there's a very defined package, and I come along and say, actually, it's going to be Josh's treatment package, and I'm going to plagiarize your material. Well, not just that there's a moral and ethical implication here of misappropriation in that case, and it's not exactly. I mean, culture is much more nuanced and important, and I'm not trying to undermine that. I'm just trying to draw an analogy here. Like, there's something that's unethical about lifting stuff without integrity and without giving credit where credit's deserved. And then that's a very important distinction. But I think that when some people, I think yoga is the easiest place to pick on. People bring yoga practices into schools and bringing a lot of cultural traditions that are not appropriate for schools because of secular nature, but also people in our Western context, yoga is like a competitive sport or an exercise. Yoga's a religion. That's a well-developed, established religion. That's our cultural interpretation of it is deeply flawed. And I think that's true for a lot of other things that are similar in that regard.
It's a good point. I'm glad that you brought it up because it was not even on my radar as something that we want to add to a conversation on mindfulness outside of, the historical complex. Like, fun fact about this curriculum.
Well, it's something I think it's something we always must consider. A lot of my research is in Syracuse City schools, which are majority Black, a large refugee population, and all the materials that I'm drawing from in the mindfulness-based practice world have been developed with white, middle to upper class individuals, the developers and the people with whom it was developed upon. And to pretend that this package is going to seamlessly fit into a totally different cultural context is really just not doing good practice, and it's not good science neither. So a lot of our work currently is thinking about this a little more carefully. Cultural adaptation, partnering with communities, asking what works, what doesn't, and why, and trying to make sense of that, because it's not good practice and it's not good science to not consider culture always.
Very true, very true. Josh, I know we're getting close to running out of time, so I just kind of love to end with, I know we've talked a lot about, the research that's ongoing, that's going to be wrapping up soon, some of the questions still to be answered, but I guess if you had sort of had to pick one question that, you don't think is going to be answered in the next couple months, with either, colleagues of yours or your own research, what's still to know about mindfulness that we should really learn ASAP? And then what one recommendation would you make to, whether it's behavior analyst, behavioral psychologist, special education, regular education teacher, what recommendation would you make in terms of the first step towards learning more about mindfulness-based curricula?
In my opinion, the most pressing research question right now, which I'm very excited that we have a project that's underway right now to get at this. I'm not saying it's going to 100% answer it, but I think we'll have contributed a lot from this, is taking a step back and as a good scientist in the behavioral tradition, or any tradition really, I would argue, what exactly is a mindfulness-based program? Can you define exactly what it is you're doing? Because I'm here to tell you that this umbrella term for mindfulness-based programming, if you take a look at those curricula, they are dramatically different in terms of content, dosage, and subcomponents. So the question that I think is most pressing, because how can one draw any generalizations about these practices that are lumped together if they're totally, we're not talking apples and oranges. I think in a lot of cases we're talking like apples and steak tartare. They're very different.
I don't know if I want that dinner. No.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They're radically different. So I think a very important question for the field is, let's be a little bit more careful in defining the thing that we're doing, and from there we'll have a little more clarity in terms of how these practices actually affect people, and be able to compare them to each other. And if you're going to develop a new practice, wouldn't you like to know what actually the practice is that you're ostensibly developing? Because that makes a big difference, A long-term question, I'll tell you this real quick. I don't know if I'm going to answer it in my lifetime, but I would love to know mindfulness practice for youth. How does that change development if it happens throughout your childhood? And how does that change who you are? I think that's a big question, but I think that there's got legs. How would that change your schooling experience? How would that shape the person you become if your context was mindful and that was part of your life? I'm very interested in that.
That's an excellent question, Josh. I know just thinking about some of the kind of short-term benefits of mindfulness, would we save children the stress of having to deal with so many problems that come from, potentially a lack of mindfulness, I guess is, a simple way to say it. Would we, even from a resource perspective, would we be able to show more benefit of using these practices over a long term rather than multiple other types of practices? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I know it's not going to be the solution, the only solution for every child, but that would just be such a great question. I mean, that's a good question, but I think everything we do in schools, right? Like which of these things actually matters and is worth doing well, and which can we sort of let go by the wayside?
That's a short-term question, and that's an empirical question. What is the mindfulness-based practice? What are the pieces that matter? What are the ingredients? And if we know that, then a lot of the other research questions come into focus a little bit more. I think that's where things are now. But down the road, if this is part of your whole schooling experience, I think that would make a very different educational experience. If your teachers are practicing, imagine if your teachers are practicing mindfulness with you in the classroom every day. How does that change everything?
I don't know. Hope we get to find out at least some of the results there, right?
I do too. And the studies that are coming out, it's interesting data. But you got to go back to the beginning, though. What are we actually talking about? Mindfulness-based programming.
If folks are interested in learning more about mindfulness, certainly the Mindfulness in the Classroom book has recently come out. I know you can pick it up everywhere. I know I got my copy on Amazon. If folks are interested in learning more about mindfulness, are there either resources or do you have a email address or of your lab or anything where people could gather more information?
So a lot of the things I'm going to mention are actually in the book. I'm going to say that I think it's a good book for if you're interested in bringing this to the classroom. And if you have kids who are struggling, I think it's a very good book for that. If you on Amazon, if our publicist says you should leave a review, that'd be helpful. I'd appreciate that. little shameless plug there. There you go. My email address is J, C as in Charles, Felver, F as in Frank, E-L, V as in Victor, E-R, at syr.edu. A lot of the work that we do, I update at least once a year, is on my lab website, which if you Google search for Mind Body Laboratory Syracuse, it will pop up. Actually, if you just remember Mind Body Laboratory, it should be one on the first page somewhere. Yeah, other resources to check out for a researcher. The American Mindfulness Research Association is a wonderful resource. There's a few large groups around the country that are just doing some really cutting edge research and have a lot of resources on their websites. I would suggest checking out the work done at University of Wisconsin-Madison. They do a lot of excellent research. The University of California, San Diego website has a ton of great stuff on there, including downloadable practices and materials. So if you type in UCSD mindfulness, that comes up. Colleagues down at University of Virginia, Penn State, UCLA, to name a few, also have really powerhouses in the contemplative practice movement. So I would direct people there too. Oh, and don't forget Brown. They have a really up-and-coming consortium. Not up-and-coming, they're well-established. They just have a lot of great stuff. So anyway, all these lists they're in the appendix of the book, but they're also places if you want to contact me, I'd be happy to talk more about them with anybody.
The book itself certainly was very specifically written to kind of speak to that replicability piece, and I think would be very helpful even for a teacher who is new to mindfulness to kind of get started as to what might this look like, whether or not that turns out to be the form they want to use, but at least gives them a sense of how could this be something that's more structured? Because I know, as someone who works in a lot of schools and I hear mindfulness, my eyes kind of glaze over, or they used to glaze over a lot more. Because it's like, what are you talking about? Like, what are we doing now? We're eating candy? I don't know what's going on here. Here is something replicable. So I really appreciated that.
Thanks, Rob. That was our intention. Something that clearly communicated the audience is the teacher or school professional, and it should be. We wrote it with the teacher or the school staff in mind. It should be something you should be able to read and be like, I understand what this is. At least it's replicable. Yeah, that's important to us.
I want to once again thank Dr. Felver for giving up so much of his time to talk about mindfulness research, mindfulness-based practices in general, and then mindfulness-based curricula in the classroom. I think many of the points he brought up are so relevant in terms of the way I think we as BCBAs and as behavior analysts like to think of science. And, it is always nice, I think, to speak to our friends in the psychology field, right? Because we're not so different after all. We're all just trying to answer important questions using great research practices, or I like to think all of us are. It sounds like Dr. Felver definitely is. So I was really glad that we could have this conversation, and I hope you found it an enlightening trip down a research pathway that you may not have thought about before. Anyway, before we wrap up, I want to make sure that everyone gets that second secret code word. It is Watchmen, WATCHMEN. Who watches The Watchmen? Did you watch Watchmen on HBO? It was really good. They might have won some Emmys. It was a really good show. Or read the comic, or know the quote, or just remember this is the code word for an episode of ABA Inside Track, Watchmen. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up this week's episode. Thank you so very, very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'd love it if you could leave us some feedback on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. Why not subscribe while you're over there? There are a lot of other ways that you can get in touch with us on the show. Certainly, there's social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram as ABA Inside Track. You can also find these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to any of the articles that we discuss in our episodes, as well as to purchase CEs for a number of our episodes. And of course, if you want a little bit of extra time with the hosts of ABA Inside Track and some additional special content you can't find anywhere else, why not head over to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe for just $5 a month to join our social trackers, where every other month we meet up with BCBAs and behavior analysts to discuss topics in the field and whatever comes to mind. If you're interested in subscribing at the $10 level, you'll also get access to our quarterly book club podcast, where we talk for hours and hours about a book related to the field of behavior analysis. And you're also able to earn 2 learning credits just for listening to those long episodes. And we've done one on meaningful differences, the classic Hart and Risley study. And by the time this comes out, you'll either be about to hear or could be hearing our discussion of neurotribes. That is our next book club winner. But you won't hear that unless you join us over on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Well, that brings us to the end of the show. Thanks again to Dr. Felver. Thanks to Jackie and Diana, too. I know they couldn't be here, but they were here in spirit. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!